So, Lisa, all these experiences later, what would you tell that Lisa who was growing up in Canada and memorizing the names of capitals of various countries? What would you tell that little Lisa?
I've always had, fortunately, a sense of curiosity and wonder about the world. And somehow or the other, growing up when I did, which is in the late 70s and 80s, there was a sense that life was an adventure. There was a greater sense of mystery, perhaps, because we didn't have Google. We didn't have GPS. We didn't have as much access to information as we have today. And perhaps that informed my sense of wonder, and it stayed with me. So I would tell that little girl, just keep going. You know, you have a lot of interesting experiences ahead of yourself, and keep the faith and keep going, which is indeed what I'm continuing to do even now.
It's an honor for me to be with you in the panel, and I did my homework.
Oh my goodness, thank you.
And I'm sure some of you know, she's an amazing writer. It's a fascinating book, if you haven't done this, read this, Close to Born. And I had a chance to read this as soon as it came, or listen to this as soon as it came out.
First, let me say I'm so honored, and I'm very honored to share the stage with you. And thank you. I'm even more thrilled to understand that you're a reader.
Thank you. So, is this Lisa Ray 2.0 or 3.0?
That's a very good question. I've lost track of the many different manifestations. Perhaps I'm closer to a cat with the many, many lives. Definitely more than 2, going on 3 or 4 right now. I think that, though broadly speaking, of course, one can divide your life perhaps as a patient into pre-cancer, PC, and post-cancer. And, in a strange way, I always reflect back on the fact that being diagnosed in 2009 with what is considered an incurable cancer, multiple myeloma, definitely informed this phase of my life. In many ways, it enriched it. And in many ways, it set me on my particular track of purposefulness and clarity. But also, I like to find meaning in everything. And I like to reframe all of our experiences as neither good nor bad, but something to derive lessons from. And I realized that when I was diagnosed in 2009, I was given a fairly scary, dire diagnosis. I was told, basically in no uncertain terms, by the hematologist who initially diagnosed me that I probably had about 5 years to live. And he showed me well laid out data points and things like that. And that's when the rebel in me perhaps reared its head, because of course I have a deep respect for science and the medical sciences, even more. My father is a scientist. He has his PhD in chemistry. However, I think that we have to account for this X factor, which is the human spirit. And fortunately, after I was diagnosed, I was contacted by another hematologist who really had, I think, the bedside manner that I was looking for as a patient. As a patient, perhaps right off the beginning, you don't want that much data. I didn't want the data. I wanted to know, what are my chances and how are we going to, what's the practical road ahead of us? How am I going to attack this? How am I going to get better? And he offered me that hope. He said, whatever it is, I'm going to throw everything at you. Now, that was 2009, and I know that you know, Dr. Abraham, that the prognosis for multiple myeloma has become very optimistic since then. It's one of the cancers, it should be really a case study, where the survival rates has improved dramatically, as well as the toolbox of treatments available to patients. And that is a great testament, I think, to, again, the power of science. CAR-T, immunotherapy has had a very direct and powerful effect on the prognosis for multiple myeloma. But also, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Kathy Giusti as well, who is, a case study in patient advocacy, because she was diagnosed before me, literally a decade before me, at the same age, 37, which is relatively rare. Most patients who are diagnosed with multiple myeloma, they're well into their 60s. So I was already a freaky case. And then I came across Kathy, who was diagnosed at the same age, but a decade before me, and was given 1 year to live. And somehow she was still around. And she had established this organization, the mmrf.org, which was advocating for more patient-centric studies and to accelerate treatments. Because particularly in the case of multiple myeloma, which is a very complex disease, and I was told it's much more like running a marathon rather than running a sprint with certain cancers. There's so many factors involved that the more tools, as in the more medication, the more forms of treatment that you have at your disposal, the greater the prognosis, the greater the chance of survival. And what was happening in her estimation is that the treatments were taking too long. Of course, there is an entire protocol that is very important, of course, run by the FDA in particular in the US. But she said, that's all very fine, but what about putting the patient at the center of the equation? Because what ends up happening is a lot of great work is done, but it's siloed. It's done in these labs that are also not communicating with each other, that are not always necessarily saying, like I say, put a picture up of a patient, and as soon as you walk into that incredible lab, make sure you remember there's a human being at the end of this equation. And I think Kathy really advocated for that really, really hard. And, I think I owe my life to her and many others, you included, for this incredible work that you do.
But I'm really curious, really fascinated. I know the first oncologist you called almost like a rabbit, right?
Yes, he was. He looked like a rabbit. He behaved like a rabbit. I was literally kicked into the rabbit hole, like Alice in Wonderland.
Right. I hope no patients will call me a rabbit and write a book about that. So you never believe this disease is going to kill you. What really gave you that inner strength?
I do even often reflect on it even today, and I'm glad that I chose to chronicle my experiences, because sometimes reflecting back, you may not remember exactly what you felt in that moment. But I think there was a combination of factors, and these are things that, hopefully we understand that there's a healing beyond the body, beyond the physical body, and even, that can be harnessed, and that's so important. But first of all, I chose again to mentally reframe this experience. Something was triggered in me. And I do feel that it was built on the foundation that I had of, my mind-body practices, yoga, meditation, a particular belief system, as I said, where I like to reframe every experience that came at me in my life as neither good nor bad, but something to live through, something that I would derive lessons from. And even though, as I said, it was kind of an extreme example, I really did feel deep down inside when I closed my eyes and I listened to that quiet inner voice that we don't hear in everyday life and is often drowned out by the noise of life. I received that message that this is not your time. You are not going to die from this. It's going to be a journey full of obstacles, but you're not going to die. And, I don't know how to define that voice. It could be your gut. It could be your higher self. It could be God himself speaking to me. I don't know exactly how, but I chose to put my faith in that voice and simultaneously, of course, listen very carefully to my doctor and follow that protocol. And I think that there is a particular alchemy that happens when we combine the two, when we combine traditional allopathic therapies that are advancing and are so important, particularly in cancer, but when we combine it with, as I said, mind-body activities, and we harness the power of the human mind and the will, faith, which is a bit of a tricky definition. It's a tricky word, because faith can be abused as well. And blind faith, I do feel, can, blind you to the beneficial, kind of choices in front of you. But faith that is informed faith, that is harnessed in this situation, I really believe that it was my faith. It was my stubbornness. Let's not discount stubbornness. And my hematologist actually said that to me at one point. He was a wonderful man. And he offered to me, very quietly on the side, because not as part of his official kind of advice, he said, I have to tell you, in my practice, the people who have really thrived, who have come out the other end, have all had that little aspect of stubbornness in them, where they refuse to let the disease get the better of them. So these were all sort of, it was like a wonderful, holistic toolbox that I intuitively, some was intuition, and some was, of course, very much grounded in medical science and in metrics and things like that.
So, of course, there are a lot of doctors in this audience. So when I communicate with the patient, I just told the stories of some of the patients who have triple-negative breast cancer or advanced leukemia. Where do I draw the line between honesty and facts and providing hope at the same time?
Honestly, that's an excellent discussion point. And it's something that I was actually discussing with someone just the other day. And it is that, because it's hard. I really do empathize with the role of the oncologist. It's really hard, and I feel I'm almost tearing up now thinking about it. Every patient is different, which is why I find it also personally very hard as a patient to offer advice. And I get a little bit wary about it, because what worked for me is not necessarily going to work for another patient. For instance, I chose to be very public with my diagnosis, and for me, that ended up being very therapeutic. It helped me find purpose during that time. So I kind of hooked my attention onto purpose as opposed to possibly spiraling into despair. But that is not for everyone at all. And so I can understand it from that point of view, that it's very, very hard for a trained clinician to understand exactly how to approach. But I do want to share that I think, universally speaking, we will never go wrong if we are kind. And how you choose to share that kindness perhaps does lie a little bit in these aspects that lie beyond, again, rational kind of metrics, And that's, everyone has intuition. You can understand, and I think that as experienced clinicians, I'm sure that you can almost intuit, what a patient, who they are, who's sitting in front of you. And you've seen human nature at its lowest. So I think that kindness, and not necessarily the kindness that tips over into deceit or trying to lie to a patient or trying to pump them up just when that's not the case, but kindness and compassion. And I try to do that myself. As I said, when someone comes to me for advice and I'm not saving lives. So I can imagine, it's a tricky conversation, but I think it's a conversation that is well worth having within the medical fraternity and having again and again and again. Whether it's reaching out to colleagues or having formal discussions. How do we approach this? Because I think more and more we're getting proof and evidence of a patient's mental state and how important that is in terms of their long-term recovery. So how, as a doctor, do you support that? Without necessarily becoming a therapist. Obviously it's really important to have those other those other therapeutic professionals to lean on as well.
Completely.
But I understand that there's probably protocol as well, and there's probably fine lines and things like that. But you know what? We feel it. We feel it when the person we're sitting in front of is sympathetic and empathetic as well. Sometimes it's intent. I think it's intent in terms of when you're delivering that message. Because as I wrote about in my book, my first oncologist, he was top of the line. He came very highly recommended. But I realized when he was delivering the message, his intent behind it was just to get it over with. This is just part of the protocol. I need to deliver the message, and then let's schedule you in to start treatment. So his intention was not at all to pause to see how I was doing emotionally. And that's why I withdrew, and I ended up finding an excellent oncologist whose intent was, we're going to get through this, we're going to heal you.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I know there are some doctors in this room who worked with me. When a student work with me or resident work with me, I always tell them, you're not going to learn anything new about the science or the biology, but I really want you to learn how to treat a patient like a human being. And it's not another stage 2 breast cancer.
Right. It's not for that patient. It's not another stage 2 breast cancer. Right. And it's a fine line. And I hope that, because I don't know enough, I hope that also doctors should have access to emotional support. Because you also carry that burden. And that is something that should be woven, I think, into medical care today, particularly within oncology, that oncologists, the deliverers of the messages, the healers, should be able to reach out to a community and say, this was a bad day. This was a tough day. And not just to your family, but there should be professional support for that, because I think that would help you dig deeper and be able then to process. Because it's hard. We do that in everyday life, right? We have to numb ourselves because there's just so much that there's just so big a burden that you can carry. So that would be my humble suggestion in terms of also offering support to the clinicians as well.
You're absolutely right. It can really burn you out. And you were 37 when you were diagnosed, and you're going through high-dose chemo and getting ready for a transplant, and you had concerns about fertility and other side effects. Now you're a mother of 2 beautiful girls, right?
Yes.
So tell us about that story.
That journey was also, very unexpected. And, again, there's nothing like cancer to create this urgency in your life of really focusing on what's important. And as it turned out, I was very laid back about this idea of motherhood for a long time. And then, boom, you get diagnosed and you think, oh my God. I never put a lot of thought into it, but I don't want to miss out on motherhood. This would be, if I get through this, when I get through this, I would like that to be a part of my life. But of course, the main task at hand is saving your life. That's number one. And at some point when I was being prepped for my first stem cell transplant, it was sort of mentioned to me, slightly throwaway and offhand, that, by the way, your fertility is going to be impacted. And, if you want to make other arrangements, you better do it now. But that was literally delivered a little bit abruptly. And I felt at that time I had so much to take on. And you were already being poked and prodded. And I wasn't even really, I didn't have a partner at that time. So I took it upon myself to freeze my eggs. And that was quite a difficult journey, added to everything that I was going on. But fortunately, I did freeze my eggs before going in for my stem cell transplant, because I was on methylene. Right. Yeah, it was like so everything was slash and burn. And I froze them, and I didn't even think about it for some time, because obviously the healing journey took precedence. And, the irony, I often say that the narrative out there, and particularly in India, is that cancer is an end. It's the end of your story somehow. It represents so many ends. And for me, cancer represented beginnings, because it was post-cancer that I ended up meeting my husband, that we got married, that we started a very different life, that we ended up relocating and moving across Asia. And so many wonderful things actually happened. And I found certain aspects of myself, my voice, my writing, my keynote career. But then after that, you know, having children became something that we were discussing. We were based in Hong Kong in those days. And because I'm on maintenance therapy, I can't carry children, you know, regardless, even if I used IVF and all of that. So then I had to reconcile myself to, okay, I mean, there's been some amazing advancements. Let's think about surrogacy. Surrogacy was officially banned in Hong Kong in those days. So then began, again, this, I really feel like I should wear an investigator Sherlock cap, because so much of my medical experiences have been about asking questions and not taking no for an answer as well. So we ended up looking for the best way, the best venue to do surrogacy. And initially we wanted to do it in India, and everything was aligned. I brought my eggs in. My husband went and donated, I think, in Barcelona, and his sperm was brought into India. So I often joke, you know, our kids were actually frequent flyers before they were born. And it all actually felt very surreal. However, 2 weeks before we were supposed to begin, the laws changed in India. And, you know, we were deeply devastated by that. And I understood the reasoning behind it, because I was tracking all of this. This was based off of also some very terrible decisions that were made by parents on the basis of a surrogacy that happened in Thailand. And then it had a domino effect, and surrogacy was re-examined in Asia. And there was a lot of abuse of the system, but I still think it was literally throwing out the baby with the bathwater, that I think better decisions could have been taken. But anyway, so we said, okay, India's taken off the table. What now? We ended up engaging an agency out of Canada. And we looked at Canada, we looked at Mexico. Nothing seemed to be lining up. There were so many obstacles. And finally, I did my research. And I said, have you thought about Georgia? At that time, Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, and the Ukraine were two places in the world where international surrogacy had been happening for a number of years. It was well established. It was being done in a very discreet manner, but it was also legal. There was a black and white legality around it. There was no gray area. So I pointed this out to my agency. I said, have you been to Georgia? Have you thought about it? The founder of the agency went to Georgia. He went to Tbilisi. He thanked me. He sent me selfies of drinking Georgian wine. He's like, thank you. What a wonderful country. It's beautiful. And so we ended up doing our surrogacy at a place called the Chachava Clinic, which is 150 years old, established and run by women. And it was a very smooth process as far as something like that could be. But also mentally, I had to adjust myself to this idea. But once I made that perspective shift that is so important and valuable, and I always think, and I'm going off on a slight tangent, I think one of the greatest assets in the world today, and what we should be teaching our children, is creative thinking, never linear thinking, problem solving and creative problem solving. So once I made that internal shift, it felt like a very easy and natural kind of process. And sure enough, I was deeply grateful. We welcomed our twins, Sufi and Soleil, in 2018. And, you know, therein started my another version of life, of motherhood. But again, I owe it to science. I owe it to medical science, you know, for pushing those boundaries and making that accessible. In my case, which I do think was because it's a medically backed surrogacy in the sense that I have no other options. So I think, I would also think in terms of also there being legislation around the world that there should be exceptions when, when we have these kinds of cases where one is medically not able to carry your children.
You finished your treatment on a Diwali day, right? In 2000.
Was it? Yes, it was. Thank you for reminding me. My God. Yes.
Right? Now it's 15 years later.
It is, yes.
So what will you tell that Lisa Rani Ray of 2009 today?
You really catch me off guard with these things because I think that, again, I had a lot of internal changes to make. And coming out of cancer, I sort of assumed that I would go back to a similar life. I was impatient. I was someone who was impatient, who was very driven, who was driven to a fault, honestly. And I would tell that person to be patient, to also be open to a different kind of life, to redefining what life can look like, and redefining success. And it's taken me this amount of time to land where I am today, which is probably, honestly, the most fulfilled and the most enriched and the happiest that I've ever been. And I never would have, that was a 37-year-old version of me. And at 37, you think life ends at 45, it all goes downhill, etc. And now today at 52, I feel like I'm just getting started. And so thanks to the treatment, and thanks to also, as I said, the attendant adjustments of going through a very, very difficult time that's helped me open my eyes to the possibility of life beyond what I thought life was. So life has become much richer than I ever thought it could be. And there's nothing, like I said, like a dire diagnosis to help you really appreciate life and live it in a much deeper and richer way. And I know that it's not me saying that. I'm sure every survivor has a version of that in their life. But Dr. Abraham, what to you today is when you wake up in the morning makes you most excited to be doing what you're doing?
And why I'm still doing it, right?
Even why you're still doing it.
Right. So, cancer care is fascinating. Fascinating. I know people ask me why you're doing oncology.
Just take it closer to you.
Yeah, so cancer care is fascinating. I know some people think, what's wrong with me, right? But it's a privilege. It's a true privilege. As you just said, I'm walking into someone's room at their most vulnerable moment in their life. And I'm there to offer them hope. They are looking at me, and I can speak for other oncologists in this room, they are looking at us as the last hope. And that's what I'm bringing to that room. So that's that intense human drama. Of course, I don't have to tell you that. You lived that. The science is fascinating. You just heard some of the, I was kind of highlighting, science is fascinating. And I've been doing this for 20 years. And I've been watching how this field has moved. And it's really exciting to do research. Of course, see that change happening in our patients. And then, of course, train the next generation of people to keep doing this for the future. So I'm a really lucky, blessed person.
But that's beautiful. That's the perspective then that you bring to the patient. And you have to know, and maybe I'm addressing also all of the doctors in the room, you have to know what a huge impact you have on an individual's life, bar none. And I very quickly wanted to just touch on one thing because I was very excited when I saw you discussing CAR-T and immuno-oncology because I have benefited from being at patient number 11 during stage 2 clinical trial at Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto. And I truly believe that that's part of the reason why I'm here. And that was also due to another doctor's passion, a hematologist's passion, and seeking me out and saying, you're the perfect profile. You've relapsed this. I have relapsed once. You've relapsed once, da-da-da-da-da. would you like to take part in this clinical trial? It just gave me so much hope, and it made me feel so empowered that, you know, a hematologist actually reached out to me and said, I believe that this can cure you. And I'll never forget another thing that he did. While I was being infused with these NK cells, he sent me a video, and he said, this is a video of a malignant NK cell attacking a cancer cell. And while you're sitting there and going through this infusion, I want you to visualize this happening in your body. And I thought, that's so powerful. And it did give me a kind of a permission to say, yes, these things are powerful and should be brought into the hospital and into medical settings more and more, things like visualization, hope, and willpower.
Thank you.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Abraham. Thank you so much, Lisa. We will continue our conversation with Lisa, and you can read all about it in the forthcoming issue of The Week. But for now, thank you so much.